The discovery of the hospital experiment files was as unsettling as it was unexpected. At first, it seemed like just another conspiracy theory, a whisper from the shadows, a rumor that could easily be dismissed. But when the journalist received the anonymous tip, the overwhelming weight of its implications began to take shape. A single encrypted email, a cryptic subject line, "The truth is buried." There was no name, no contact information, only a set of coordinates and a vague message. The files were hidden deep within the vaults of a forgotten hospital, tucked away under decades of silence, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. The journalist, a former investigative reporter turned independent truth seeker after a series of failed attempts to expose corruption in other cases, was immediately drawn in. The tip spoke to something buried deep inside him. The desire to dig into the darkness that others were too afraid to face, to expose the stories that had been locked away. But even he wasn't prepared for what he was about to find. The hospital in question, once one of the most reputable institutions in the country, had a history that stretched back over 100 years. Founded on principles of healing and care, it had been at the forefront of medical advancement, a beacon of progress in a time when many other hospitals were still struggling with basic care. But it wasn't always what it seemed. Behind the polished exterior, in the sterile halls and beneath the white coats of its revered doctors, a darker agenda had been taking shape for years, an agenda that blurred the line between medical research and horrific experimentation. The files, according to the anonymous tip, contained detailed accounts of an experimental program that had been run within the hospital's walls. This program, which had started as a seemingly innocuous study on psychological conditions and treatments, had turned into something far more sinister. Volunteers had been promised medical care, offered treatment for their ailments, only to become unwilling subjects in an elaborate, ethically questionable experiment. As the journalist pored over the files in his small, dimly lit office, he could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. These were not just any experiments, these were tests that no one had ever meant for the public to know about. The truth had been buried so deep that even those who had worked there were unaware of its true scale. The initial shock came when he read through the first batch of documents. Patient after patient, their names carefully listed in neat, impersonal columns. Some had volunteered willingly, seeking help for conditions ranging from depression to schizophrenia. Others had been coerced, caught in a trap of desperation, too vulnerable to understand the full extent of what they were signing up for. The experimentation was described in clinical, almost detached language, as if the lives of those involved were nothing more than data points to be analyzed, manipulated, and discarded when no longer useful. As the journalist dug deeper into the files, he found names of doctors who had once been lauded as pioneers in their field, their reputations now tarnished by their involvement in what could only be described as medical malpractice on a massive scale. There were no ethical reviews, no informed consent forms, just a shadowy network of medical professionals, all working under the guise of legitimacy. Some of them had been swept away by the storm of scandal when the program was quietly shut down, their careers ruined, but others had simply disappeared, erased from the record as if they had never existed at all. One particular name stood out: Dr. Edward Mallory, a man who had once been heralded as a visionary in the field of psychiatry. His reputation, built on years of groundbreaking research, had helped shape the hospital's image as a progressive institution. But in the confidential files, his name appeared time and time again, each mention darker than the last. Dr. Mallory had been one of the key figures behind the program, overseeing its development and execution. He had pushed the boundaries of medical ethics, driven by an obsession with discovering the limits of the human mind. Under his leadership, the hospital had turned its patients into subjects, their suffering the price of his ambition. The further the journalist went, the more the story began to unravel. Dr. Mallory wasn't working alone. As the files began to show, a network of other medical professionals had been complicit in the experiments, all equally driven by their own motivations. Some sought fame, others power, but all shared one thing in common: a willingness to cross moral boundaries in the name of scientific progress. They had operated under the radar for years, manipulating and controlling the narrative of what was happening inside the hospital. Any patients who began to question the procedures were dismissed as unreliable, their complaints ignored or retracted. Those who spoke out found themselves silenced, often through mysterious means. The few who had tried to report what they had seen were quickly discredited, their words dismissed as the ravings of paranoid individuals. But what truly shocked the journalist was the connection between the hospital's experiments and powerful political figures. There were hints, subtle references in the files, that suggested a larger conspiracy, one that extended far beyond the walls of the institution. The experiments were not simply a matter of rogue doctors pushing the envelope of medical science. No, there were those at the highest levels of government who had known about the experiments, who had either turned a blind eye or actively encouraged them. The funding had come from anonymous sources, funneled through secretive organizations, all with ties to government agencies. There were whispers of covert operations, of psychological warfare, and of an attempt to shape the future of society through control of the human mind. With each new revelation, the journalist's sense of dread grew. He had been warned, but he hadn't fully understood the gravity of what he was stepping into. The deeper he delved, the more dangerous the investigation became. His phone rang constantly, but whenever he answered, no one was there. He received strange emails, threats veiled as warnings, and cryptic messages that seemed to be designed to scare him off. His every move was being watched, and he knew it. The fear wasn't just in the air, it was palpable. Someone didn't want him uncovering the truth. Someone with far more power than he could imagine was willing to go to great lengths to keep this story buried. The files continued to reveal more disturbing details. The scope of the experiment was staggering, not just limited to a few dozen patients but hundreds, possibly thousands. And the consequences had been catastrophic. Many of the patients had died as a result of the procedures, their bodies left to rot in unmarked graves. Others had been left with permanent damage, both physical and mental. The toll on the victims was unfathomable, and yet, it was clear that the hospital's administration had done everything in its power to erase the records, to make the whole thing disappear as if it had never happened. The journalist couldn't help but think of the survivors, those who had escaped the experiments but were left to carry the scars for the rest of their lives. Some of them had gone into hiding, afraid of being caught, afraid of being silenced. Others had lived in a constant state of paranoia, never knowing who to trust, always looking over their shoulder. But there were a few who had fought back, who had attempted to expose the horrors of what had occurred. They had been ignored, ridiculed, and ultimately forgotten. As the journalist pieced together the puzzle, it became clear that the story wasn't just about a hospital. It was about the powerful forces that had worked behind the scenes to control people, to manipulate them, and to erase their suffering from history. It was a story of corruption, betrayal, and a tragic abuse of power that had left countless lives in ruin. And it was a story that, despite all his efforts, might never see the light of day. The history of the hospital was one that had once been celebrated, lauded as a model of progress in medical care. It had been founded in the early 20th century, in an era where hospitals were still struggling to adapt to the rapid advancements in medical science. The founders, a group of well-respected doctors and philanthropists, had made it their mission to create a facility that would push the boundaries of medicine, offering care to all regardless of their socioeconomic status. They had envisioned a place where the sick and the wounded could receive treatment of the highest quality, where research could be conducted to uncover the deepest mysteries of the human body and mind. In its early years, the hospital had gained a stellar reputation. Word spread quickly about the innovative procedures and treatments that were being pioneered within its walls. It became a beacon for those seeking cutting-edge care, attracting patients from across the country. The hospital's success, however, was not just rooted in its medical achievements, but also in its ability to market itself as a place of hope and healing. Its administrators were careful to maintain a carefully crafted image, a pristine reputation that hid the darker truths buried beneath its gleaming exterior. But as time passed, whispers began to circulate. Rumors spread about the strange practices that were taking place behind the scenes. Patients spoke in hushed tones about the experimental treatments they had been subjected to, of procedures that seemed far more invasive than what was necessary. At first, these were dismissed as the fears of overactive imaginations, but as more patients began to speak up, the hospital's pristine reputation began to crack. Dr. Edward Mallory had been a part of the hospital since its early days, joining as a young and ambitious psychiatrist with a deep interest in the human mind. He was quickly promoted to a senior position due to his groundbreaking work in the field of mental health. He was charismatic, well-spoken, and driven by an insatiable desire to push the boundaries of what was considered ethical in his field. Dr. Mallory's research focused primarily on the treatment of psychological disorders, particularly those that were considered incurable at the time. His work with patients suffering from severe depression, schizophrenia, and other mental illnesses was highly regarded. He presented himself as a man of science, someone dedicated to finding new ways to heal those who were suffering. However, as Mallory's influence grew, so did his ambition. He became obsessed with understanding the very core of the human mind, with unraveling the mysteries of consciousness and behavior. In his pursuit of knowledge, he began to push the limits of ethical boundaries. What had once been a pursuit of medical progress began to transform into something much darker. Mallory believed that true understanding of the human psyche could only be achieved through experimentation, through pushing patients to their absolute limits. And the hospital, eager to maintain its status as a leader in medical research, turned a blind eye to the increasingly unethical methods he employed. The first signs of trouble came in the early 1930s when Mallory began to conduct highly controversial experiments on his patients. What had begun as a simple experiment to understand the effects of various medications on mental health soon escalated into something far more disturbing. Mallory's experiments began to involve more invasive procedures, some of which bordered on the cruel and inhumane. He began to subject patients to extreme psychological stress, using a combination of isolation, sensory deprivation, and extreme emotional manipulation. His goal was not just to treat but to break the patients down completely, to observe how their minds would respond to the intense pressures he subjected them to. At first, the results seemed promising. Patients who had been unresponsive to traditional treatments showed signs of improvement under Mallory's care. However, these improvements came at a steep cost. Many patients experienced severe psychological trauma as a result of Mallory's methods. Some were left in a state of permanent mental disarray, unable to function in society. Others became so disturbed by the experiments that they attempted to end their lives. But Mallory saw these side effects not as failures, but as part of the process, the necessary casualties in the pursuit of knowledge. As the years went on, Mallory's methods became more extreme. He began to recruit patients who had no prior history of mental illness, people who were simply seeking treatment for minor ailments or those looking for a way to improve their lives. These individuals, who had no idea what they were signing up for, became unwitting subjects in his increasingly dangerous experiments. Mallory used them to test new treatments and techniques, many of which had never been tested on humans before. These experiments were often conducted in secret, with no official documentation and no oversight. Mallory kept meticulous notes on his findings, but these notes were hidden away, locked in the files that would eventually be discovered years later. In the years leading up to the closure of the program, rumors began to circulate among the hospital staff. Nurses, doctors, and other employees had begun to notice strange things happening behind the scenes. Patients who had been under Mallory's care began to act erratically, exhibiting bizarre behaviors that could not be explained by their conditions. Some patients became withdrawn, while others showed signs of aggression and paranoia. The staff began to suspect that something was deeply wrong, but many were afraid to speak out. The hospital had a powerful reputation to protect, and any accusations of malpractice could ruin careers. So, those who had concerns kept quiet, brushing off their suspicions as nothing more than overblown rumors. But there were those who couldn't ignore the truth. One of the nurses, a woman named Margaret, had witnessed the slow deterioration of several patients under Mallory's care. She had tried to raise her concerns with the hospital administration, but her warnings had been dismissed. Desperate to make others understand what was happening, Margaret secretly began to document her own observations. She began to collect evidence of the mistreatment of patients, including photographs of the patients' injuries and testimonies from those who had been subjected to the experiments. She risked everything to expose the truth, knowing that if she were caught, she could lose her job, or worse. Margaret's findings, however, did not immediately lead to the exposure of the program. The hospital administration had managed to cover up most of the wrongdoing, silencing those who tried to speak out. In the end, it wasn't Margaret's efforts that brought the program to an end, but the growing number of unexplained deaths among patients. As the death toll climbed, the hospital could no longer ignore the public outcry. The program was quietly shut down, and Mallory was removed from his position. But the files were kept hidden, buried in the archives where they remained untouched for decades. As the years passed, the hospital began to rebuild its reputation, carefully erasing all traces of the scandal. The administration worked tirelessly to ensure that no one would ever question the hospital's legacy. They covered up the records, destroyed documents, and even manipulated the press to ensure that the story would never see the light of day. But the truth had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deep it was buried. And when the files were finally uncovered, the full extent of the horror came into sharp focus. The victims of Mallory's experiments, many of whom had long since disappeared from public view, began to emerge from the shadows. Some of them had survived the experiments, though their lives had been forever scarred. Others had never been heard from again, their fates a mystery that no one had cared to solve. But their stories were about to be told, and the world would finally know the dark truth that had been hidden for so many years. The hospital's experimental program had always been shrouded in secrecy, its existence buried beneath a layer of carefully maintained public relations and professional acclaim. But as the journalist began to peel back the layers of the story, a disturbing pattern emerged. It became clear that the experiments, which had initially seemed isolated and focused on mental health treatments, had escalated into something much more sinister. What had begun as a simple attempt to understand psychological disorders had spiraled out of control into a massive, government-supported initiative designed to test the limits of human endurance and manipulation. The early stages of the experiment had been under the guise of medical care. Patients, many of whom were suffering from debilitating mental illnesses, had been offered what seemed like a revolutionary new form of treatment. Mallory and his colleagues promised cures for conditions that had long been seen as incurable. Schizophrenia, severe depression, bipolar disorder, these were conditions that had plagued society for centuries, and the promise of a treatment, a breakthrough, had sparked hope. But this hope was short-lived. At first, the procedures seemed relatively benign. Patients were given experimental drugs, subjected to various forms of therapy, and monitored closely. But as time went on, the treatments became more invasive, more extreme. Mallory, in his obsessive quest for knowledge, began to explore more unorthodox methods. The idea of using shock therapy, extreme isolation, and sensory deprivation techniques became a central part of the experiments. Patients were not just treated, they were pushed to the edge of human endurance, with Mallory and his team watching closely as their minds and bodies responded to the stress. What had once been a controlled study began to morph into something darker. As Mallory's research grew more ambitious, the ethical guidelines that had originally been established to protect the patients began to disintegrate. There were no informed consent forms, no oversight from medical ethics boards, no safeguards to ensure the patient's well-being. What had started as an attempt to help those suffering from mental health disorders had turned into a twisted pursuit of scientific knowledge at any cost. The patients, many of whom were vulnerable and desperate for help, became nothing more than subjects in an experiment. They were manipulated, broken, and discarded once they had outlived their usefulness. The files, which the journalist was now desperately piecing together, painted a chilling picture of what had happened behind the hospital's closed doors. Some of the patients had been fully aware of the treatments they were undergoing, but many had not. Some were coerced into participation, their desperation for a cure exploited by the very people they trusted. Mallory had convinced them that these extreme measures were necessary for their recovery, that they were part of a groundbreaking study that would revolutionize the field of psychiatry. In reality, they were nothing more than guinea pigs in a deadly game of human experimentation. As the experiments grew more intense, the patients began to experience the consequences of Mallory's methods. Some began to show signs of psychological deterioration. Patients who had once been stable, even if suffering from severe disorders, were now slipping into deeper levels of madness. The effects of the drugs, combined with the extreme conditions they were subjected to, led to irreversible damage. Some patients became catatonic, unable to speak or move. Others developed violent tendencies, lashing out at anyone who came near. The more Mallory pushed his patients, the more unpredictable the results became. The hospital staff, many of whom were too afraid or too complicit to speak out, began to notice the changes. The first signs of distress came from the nurses who worked closely with the patients. They reported unusual behavior, strange mood swings, and violent outbursts. The patients who had once been docile and compliant were now unrecognizable, their personalities shattered by the experiments. The nurses began to question the treatments, wondering whether they were truly helping the patients or driving them further into madness. But any concerns raised were quickly dismissed by the higher-ups. Mallory had too much influence and his reputation was too powerful to challenge. Those who tried to speak out were silenced, either through subtle intimidation or outright dismissal. But despite the attempts to keep the truth hidden, the cracks in the facade began to show. One of the nurses, a woman named Evelyn, had been working at the hospital for over a decade. She had witnessed firsthand the changes in the patients, but it wasn't until she overheard a conversation between Mallory and a colleague that she began to realize just how far the experiments had gone. The two doctors were discussing the success of a new procedure, one that involved inducing extreme psychological trauma to test the patient's ability to recover. Evelyn was horrified. She had been under the impression that the treatments were designed to help the patients, not to break them. Determined to understand the full scope of what was happening, Evelyn began to gather information. She started taking notes, recording the strange behaviors of the patients, the unapproved treatments that were being used, and the increasing number of casualties. But she knew that she couldn't act alone. She reached out to a few of her trusted colleagues, but most were too afraid to get involved. In the end, only one doctor, a young resident named Dr. Peter Harris, agreed to help. Together, they began to compile evidence of the abuse taking place within the hospital. Their investigation was slow and dangerous. They had to be careful. Mallory and his colleagues were powerful, and any attempt to expose them could cost them their jobs, their reputations, or worse. As Evelyn and Peter gathered more information, they realized that they were up against something far bigger than they had originally thought. The hospital had been covering up the deaths and disappearances of patients for years, and there was a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the walls of the institution. The files they uncovered revealed that the experiments were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, systemic pattern of abuse. The deeper Evelyn and Peter dug, the more they began to realize that Mallory wasn't working alone. His research had attracted the attention of powerful individuals outside the hospital, people with political connections and financial resources. It became clear that the experiments were not just a matter of rogue doctors pushing the boundaries of medical science. No, this was something far more insidious. The hospital was a pawn in a much larger game, one that involved manipulating public perception and controlling the masses. The experiments, in their twisted logic, were a means to an end, a way to test the limits of human control. The files revealed that Mallory had been working with high-ranking government officials, providing them with data on the effects of psychological manipulation and control. It was a disturbing revelation. The hospital had become a testing ground for social engineering experiments, and the patients who had entered the hospital seeking help had been used as lab rats in a larger, government-backed project. As the journalist pieced together the puzzle, he was struck by the sheer scale of the operation. The hospital wasn't just an isolated case of medical malpractice. It was part of a larger conspiracy, one that had been carefully orchestrated over decades. The power structures that had enabled Mallory and his colleagues to continue their experiments without consequence were staggering. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the story was far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The deeper the journalist dug, the more dangerous the investigation became. His life began to unravel in ways he hadn't expected. He started receiving anonymous threats and strange things began to happen. His office was broken into, his computers hacked, and his phone line tapped. Whoever was behind the cover-up didn't want the truth to come out, and they were willing to go to any lengths to stop him. But the journalist couldn't stop now. The truth was too important. With every new piece of information he uncovered, he could feel the weight of the story pressing down on him. He had to expose what had happened, no matter the cost. As he read through the final pages of the files, he knew that what he was about to uncover would change everything, not just for the hospital but for the entire medical community. The scope of the experiments, the collusion between powerful individuals, the suffering of the patients, it all pointed to something far larger, something more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. But as the journalist sat there, staring at the files, he realized that the most horrifying part of the story had yet to be revealed. The truth, he knew, would be even darker than he could have ever predicted. As the journalist dug deeper into the unsettling world of the hospital's secret experiments, the weight of his discoveries grew heavier with each passing day. He had unearthed the first threads of a conspiracy so deeply woven into the fabric of the institution that it seemed nearly impossible to untangle. But the more he uncovered, the clearer it became. What had started as a medical experiment had blossomed into a full-fledged cover-up, orchestrated by some of the most powerful individuals in the country. The more the journalist learned, the more dangerous the investigation became. But there was no turning back now. The truth, no matter how dark, had to be brought to light. The whistleblower who had first tipped him off about the hidden files was gone. Vanished without a trace, as if swallowed by the very shadows that had been lurking behind the hospital's closed doors for so many years. The only remaining evidence of their existence was the encrypted message the journalist had received, a haunting warning that the conspiracy ran far deeper than anyone could imagine. Whoever had sent the message had known what was at stake. They had known the kind of power that was protecting the hospital's secrets, and they had known the risks involved in trying to expose it. The journalist had been given just enough information to start unraveling the story, but he knew now that he was in over his head. He wasn't the only one, though. As he scoured the files, he began to see a pattern emerging, one that painted a picture of a network of individuals who had conspired to keep the horrors of the hospital hidden. The corruption reached all the way to the highest levels of the medical and political communities. At the very heart of this dark web was Dr. Edward Mallory, a man whose influence had spread far beyond the hospital, entangling politicians, wealthy businessmen, and others who had much to gain from the continuation of his work. The more the journalist uncovered, the more he realized that Mallory wasn't just running an isolated experiment in the back rooms of a hospital. This was part of something far larger, something with far-reaching implications for society as a whole. The experiments at the hospital had been a testing ground for social control, a way to experiment with psychological manipulation on a mass scale. The victims had been caught in the crossfire of a grand experiment, their suffering used as a tool for a larger agenda. The deeper the journalist dug, the more disturbing the revelations became. The files contained not only medical records but also correspondence between Mallory and high-ranking government officials. These documents were riddled with technical jargon and euphemisms, but the journalist could read between the lines. The experiments had been designed not just to study the human mind but to understand how it could be controlled. Mallory had been working on methods to break people down, to push them to their limits, and then rebuild them in a way that made them more compliant, more easily manipulated. The chilling reality was that the hospital had been part of a covert government operation, one that involved not only medical experimentation but also psychological warfare. The patients who had been subjected to these treatments were not just victims of rogue doctors. They had been chosen because of their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses. The experiments had been designed to exploit these weaknesses, to see how far a person could be pushed before they broke. Mallory and his team had tested every form of psychological manipulation, from sensory deprivation to extreme isolation, to induce the most profound changes in their subjects. At first, the experiments seemed harmless enough. Mild treatments to test the effects of certain drugs or therapies on patients with mental illnesses. But as Mallory's research progressed, the line between treatment and torture blurred. Patients began to disappear from the hospital without explanation. Their families were told they had been transferred, or that they had left voluntarily. But the truth was far darker. The hospital had begun quietly disposing of patients who were deemed too unstable or too damaged by the experiments. Some had been moved to undisclosed locations, while others had simply vanished into thin air, their fates never recorded in any official documents. The journalist began to uncover the names of these missing patients, people who had entered the hospital with nothing but a desire for help, only to be used as test subjects in Mallory's twisted experiments. Many of them had been too vulnerable to resist the treatments. They were poor, mentally ill, or struggling with addiction. The hospital had preyed on their desperation, promising them relief in exchange for their participation. But what they received in return was far worse than they could have ever imagined. They had become nothing more than pawns in a deadly game, and their suffering was the cost of the grand experiment. As the journalist sifted through the evidence, he discovered that the experiments had escalated beyond psychological manipulation. Mallory had started to push the boundaries of physical control as well. There were documents detailing the use of electroshock therapy, hypnosis, and even chemical lobotomies on patients who were deemed too resistant to the program. Mallory and his colleagues had justified these extreme measures as necessary steps in their research, but the reality was much more sinister. These treatments were designed to break the patient's wills, to erase their identities, and to make them more malleable to the doctor's will. One particular case stood out among the others. A patient who had been subjected to a series of increasingly invasive treatments, all in the name of research. The patient, a young woman in her early 20s, had entered the hospital seeking help for what was later diagnosed as severe depression. But instead of receiving the care she needed, she had become the subject of a series of cruel experiments. She was subjected to prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and repeated doses of experimental drugs. She was monitored closely, but no one seemed to care about the damage being done to her mind and body. The files detailed her slow descent into madness. Her once brilliant mind began to deteriorate as she was subjected to Mallory's methods. At first, she was compliant, believing that the treatments would help her. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the young woman began to lose her sense of self. She became paranoid, withdrawn, and increasingly violent. Her doctors, far from intervening, saw this as proof that the experiment was working, that she was breaking through to something deeper within her psyche. But the truth was far more horrific. The young woman was no longer the person she had once been. She had been shattered by the treatment, her mind irreparably damaged by the psychological and physical abuse she had endured. As the journalist read through the details of this particular case, a feeling of dread washed over him. This was not an isolated incident. This was the reality for countless patients who had passed through the hospital's doors. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the hospital's true legacy wasn't one of medical progress but of suffering and manipulation. These patients had been used as nothing more than test subjects, their pain and trauma a necessary cost of the doctor's experiments. But the most disturbing part of the story wasn't just the horrific treatment of these patients. It was the fact that the hospital had gotten away with it for so long. The public had been kept in the dark, and the few who had tried to expose the truth had been silenced. The system had worked tirelessly to cover up the abuse, to protect the reputations of the powerful men behind the experiments. Even as the bodies of the patients piled up, the hospital's administrators had managed to keep the truth hidden. The journalist's investigation had uncovered the brutal reality of what had happened, but the battle was far from over. The deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. He knew that the people behind the hospital's experiments would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. His life, like the lives of the patients he had learned about, was now in grave danger. But he couldn't stop. Not now. The truth had to come out. And no matter the cost, he would make sure it did. The journalist's investigation had taken him further into the dark heart of the hospital's past than he had ever imagined. Every new piece of evidence he uncovered seemed to only deepen the mystery and heighten the danger surrounding the story. As he combed through the labyrinth of medical records, personal testimonies, and government correspondence, the weight of the conspiracy became even more evident. This wasn't just about a few rogue doctors or a misguided experiment. No, this was part of something far larger, a systemic abuse of power that reached far beyond the walls of the hospital. The more the journalist unearthed, the clearer it became that the hospital's experiments were not only being shielded by the institution but were actively supported by influential figures in the government and medical community. The experiments had gone beyond the realm of legitimate scientific inquiry and had become a tool of control, a way to test how far human beings could be pushed before they broke. What had initially been framed as an exploration of mental illness and psychiatric treatment had morphed into an insidious experiment in social manipulation. Patients weren't just being treated, they were being tested for their limits, their vulnerabilities exploited for the sake of data that could be used for political and military purposes. One of the most startling revelations came when the journalist uncovered a series of highly confidential documents that connected the hospital's work to a network of political and military leaders. These documents detailed how the government had been funding Mallory's experiments from the very beginning, offering grants and financial support to help him push the boundaries of psychological research. Mallory's early work, focusing on behavioral modification and therapy for mental health patients, had been seen as a potential goldmine for the government. If Mallory could develop a way to control minds, to break down individuals and rebuild them into compliant citizens, it could be used for far more than just medical treatment. It could be weaponized. The documents outlined a disturbing pattern of experimentation. Mallory and his colleagues had been tasked with developing methods of psychological manipulation that could be used for military purposes. One project in particular stood out, a government-funded initiative called Project Control, which was aimed at developing a new breed of soldiers who could be trained to endure extreme conditions without question, who could be molded into the perfect operatives, free from the emotional and psychological baggage that could interfere with their missions. It was a chilling plan, one that sought to turn human beings into mere tools for the state, their minds no longer their own. Mallory's experiments at the hospital became a testing ground for this dark ambition. The patients, many of whom were poor, mentally ill, or suffering from addiction, became unwitting test subjects for the government's covert military program. The medical procedures they were subjected to were not only unethical but in many cases downright barbaric. They were tested not only on their mental endurance but on their physical capabilities as well. Some patients were subjected to extreme forms of sensory deprivation, others to sleep deprivation for days at a time, all in an effort to see how their minds could be manipulated and controlled. The results were horrifying. Some patients, pushed beyond their breaking points, had lost their sense of self. Their personalities were fractured, their minds shattered by the intense pressure. They became mere shells of their former selves, their thoughts and actions controlled by the doctors overseeing the experiments. Others had become violent, their anger and paranoia boiling over into uncontrollable fits of rage. The experiments were having a devastating effect, but Mallory and his team continued, convinced that the end justified the means. As the journalist dug further into these documents, he realized that the scope of the experiment was far larger than he had initially suspected. The hospital had been just one cog in a much bigger machine, a machine designed to create a new kind of human being, one who could be controlled, manipulated, and used for whatever purpose those in power deemed fit. The patients, those poor souls who had come to the hospital seeking help, had become the first casualties of this larger, more insidious plan. With this new understanding, the journalist began to re-examine the timeline of events. The first wave of experiments, which had started with a small group of patients, had been relatively benign. But as Mallory's success with his methods grew, The scope of the experiments expanded. More patients were brought in and the procedures became more extreme. What had once been a matter of medical research had turned into something more like a military operation. The hospital had become a front for a government experiment in psychological warfare, and the patients were the unsuspecting victims of a dark agenda that few could have imagined. The journalist's mind raced as he tried to connect the dots. He had uncovered evidence of government funding, military involvement, and even high-ranking officials who had been complicit in covering up the truth. But the most disturbing part of the story wasn't just the scale of the conspiracy, it was the fact that for so long no one had noticed. The hospital's experiments had been carried out with such precision, such secrecy, that the outside world had no idea what was really happening. The patients had been discarded, their lives ruined, and yet the hospital had maintained its reputation as a beacon of medical progress. It was a carefully constructed illusion, one that had fooled not just the public, but those who had worked within the system itself. The more the journalist uncovered, the more he began to see the full extent of the manipulation. The files revealed a chilling pattern of psychological warfare, in which the hospital's patients were used as pawns in a much larger game. They were pushed to their limits, their minds tested and broken, all in the name of science and national security. But the truth was far darker. Mallory and his colleagues were not just experimenting for the sake of progress. They were experimenting with people's lives, using them as tools to create a new breed of human being. And in the process they had ruined countless lives. The journalist was left with a moral dilemma. He had uncovered the truth, but what good would it do to expose it? The hospital's powerful supporters would stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden. They had already silenced those who had tried to speak out, and now, as the journalist grew closer to the heart of the conspiracy, he realized that his own safety was in jeopardy. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous his investigation became. He had already received anonymous threats and he knew that his life was at risk. But he couldn't stop now. The truth had to come out no matter the cost. As the journalist continued his search for answers, he found himself at a crossroads. He had uncovered the most disturbing part of the story, the connection between the hospital's experiments and the government's military interests. He knew that exposing this truth would be dangerous, that it would put him in direct conflict with some of the most powerful people in the country. But he couldn't ignore the suffering of the victims, the innocent lives that had been destroyed by this dark experiment. The journalist knew that the story had to be told, no matter the personal cost. He had no choice but to press on to expose the full extent of the conspiracy. The patients who had suffered, the lives that had been shattered, all needed to be heard. And he, as their last hope for justice, would ensure that their voices were not silenced. No matter what it took, he would expose the truth, and in doing so he would risk everything. As the journalist began to piece together the final layers of this harrowing story, a sense of foreboding settled in. He had uncovered the bulk of the hospital's hidden history, the corrupt, unethical experiments conducted under the guise of medical research, the manipulation of vulnerable patients, the collusion of powerful figures in the medical and political sectors. Each new discovery had brought him closer to the truth, but also further into the clutches of those who wanted the story buried forever. There was no way to unsee what he had found, and with each passing day, the threats against him grew more real, more immediate. His phone rang less frequently, but when it did, it was always a silent, breathless line. He had begun to notice shadowy figures tailing him, the same unfamiliar cars parked outside his apartment building, their drivers watching him with unsettling intent. It was clear that someone somewhere wanted him to stop. But there was no turning back. The truth was out there and he would risk everything to expose it. The final piece of the puzzle came when the journalist traced the connection between the hospital's experiments and the dark undercurrents of government surveillance programs. As he dug into the files, he found evidence suggesting that the experiments were not only part of a psychological manipulation program but also part of a broader attempt by government agencies to control the minds of the general public. The experiments had been designed not just to test the limits of individual patients, but to understand how people could be controlled on a mass scale. In other words, what had started as a covert military operation had evolved into a national-level social experiment, one that sought to manipulate the very way people thought, felt, and behaved. The journalist had uncovered early references to an operation known only by a code name, Project Echo. The documents were sparse, containing little more than vague references to psychological experiments, but the implications were staggering. Project Echo seemed to be an initiative by a covert faction of the government, possibly tied to intelligence agencies, which sought to monitor and manipulate individuals based on the findings of Mallory's research. While the details remained elusive, the connections were impossible to ignore. There were references to social behavior modification, techniques for altering perception, controlling public opinion, and influencing voting patterns. The scale of this was beyond anything the journalist had imagined. He began to realize that Mallory's experiments at the hospital had been merely the first stage of a larger experiment in social control, an operation designed to shape the behavior of individuals for political gain. What the patients had suffered was a microcosm of what was potentially being planned on a national, even global scale. Mallory had laid the groundwork with his patients, testing how to break them, rebuild them, and remold them into something more useful. But the real goal of the experiment seemed to be a broader, more terrifying one: to see how the entire population could be manipulated and controlled without their knowledge. At this point, the journalist knew he was dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than he had originally anticipated. The hospital, with its powerful allies in the government, was at the epicenter of a multifaceted conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the country's institutions. He had uncovered evidence suggesting that the hospital had been funded not only by private donors but also by top military and intelligence agencies, eager to learn from the failures and successes of the early experiments. These agencies had been looking for ways to apply Mallory's findings to control the public, to create a system in which individuals could be molded and shaped like clay to fit a political agenda. The more the journalist uncovered, the more he realized how widespread and insidious the problem was. The experiments conducted at the hospital weren't just isolated events. They were part of a larger, coordinated effort to test social control techniques in a real-world environment. Mallory's patients had been subjected to a trial run of these tactics, their emotions, perceptions, and behaviors manipulated to see how they could be broken and rebuilt. And when the hospital closed its doors on the experiments, it wasn't the end of the project. The data had been collected, and it had been put to use elsewhere. The journalist's growing sense of dread was palpable. He was no longer just investigating a medical scandal. He was uncovering a deep-state conspiracy that threatened to upend everything he had ever believed about his country. As he connected the dots between the hospital, Mallory, the government, and the broader social control experiments, a picture began to emerge, one that was as horrifying as it was compelling. There was an undeniable feeling of powerlessness in all of this. The patients who had been subjected to the experiments had been pawns, their lives reduced to mere data points in an insidious social experiment. Many of them had disappeared, their fates unknown. Others had been left with permanent psychological scars, their identities fractured by the brutal techniques used on them. And yet, the public remained blissfully unaware of what had happened. The hospital had been protected, its reputation safeguarded by the wealth and influence of those who had financed it. No one had been held accountable, and the public had been told nothing. The journalist had found his calling in exposing the truth, but now, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the implications of his investigation were far greater than he could have ever imagined. The people behind the conspiracy were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to ensure that their secrets remained buried. It was becoming increasingly clear that there would be no easy way out. Those who had dared to uncover the truth before him had either been silenced, discredited, or worse. The journalist could only wonder how long he had before they came for him, before his own name joined the list of those who had disappeared without a trace. And yet, as he read through the final set of documents, he felt a rush of determination. The data, the notes, the letters, the reports, everything was there. The story he had uncovered, the horrific truth about what had happened in that hospital, was now laid bare for the world to see. He had one chance, one opportunity to bring this dark conspiracy into the light, to expose the forces that had manipulated not just the hospital's patients but an entire population. He sat at his desk, staring at the documents on his screen, knowing that every word he wrote could be the last he would ever publish. There was no going back, no second chances. The risks were enormous, but the stakes had never been higher. If he could just find a way to get this information into the hands of the public, to expose the dark forces behind the hospital's experiments and the government's manipulation of its citizens, perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for redemption. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he considered the enormity of the task ahead. There were too many unanswered questions, too many victims whose voices had been silenced for far too long. But this wasn't just a story about an institution that had gone astray, it was a story about power, control, and the price of freedom. It was a story that had to be told, no matter the consequences. As he began typing the first words of his exposé, the journalist knew that this was not just about uncovering a single dark chapter in history. This was about rewriting the narrative itself, about shaking the very foundation of the system that had allowed such abuses to thrive. And though the risks were great, the truth was more powerful than fear. It always had been. The journalist's fingers flew over the keyboard as he started to compose the first draft of what would become the most dangerous story of his career. The weight of the investigation hung heavily on him. The lives that had been lost, the families left behind, the untold suffering that had been inflicted in the name of science. Every sentence he typed was a step closer to exposing a truth so deep and dark, it could shake the very foundations of the system that had allowed it all to happen. He knew that once he published the story, there would be no going back. His life would change forever, and the consequences of his actions would reverberate far beyond the walls of his office. But there was no other choice. The victims of the hospital's experiments, the ones who had been silenced, deserved to have their voices heard. And the world needed to know the truth. As he typed, the journalist reflected on the terrifying scope of the conspiracy he had uncovered. It wasn't just the horrors inside the hospital, nor even the twisted experiments that Mallory had conducted. The real horror lay in the far-reaching consequences of those experiments, the government's plans to use them as the foundation for a new era of social control. The very methods Mallory had pioneered, psychological manipulation, mind control, and the systematic breakdown of human identity, were being tested not just on patients but on entire populations. What had started as a few isolated experiments in a hospital in the middle of a city had evolved into something more insidious, a covert operation that threatened to reshape society as a whole. The experiments at the hospital had been a testing ground, but the broader application of those techniques could not have been more disturbing. The government had funded Mallory's research because they recognized its potential for mass manipulation. What began as a series of psychological experiments on individual patients had grown into a blueprint for a national program that could manipulate public opinion, shape political movements, and even alter the way people interacted with one another. The government's interest in Mallory's work wasn't just about curing mental illness. It was about weaponizing the human mind, using it to control the masses and create a society where individual autonomy was a thing of the past. And Mallory wasn't the only one involved. As the journalist traced the money trails, he discovered a network of individuals who had facilitated the hospital's experiments. Men and women in positions of power, from high-ranking government officials to corporate elites, all of whom had seen the potential for financial and political gain in Mallory's work. They had helped fund the program, ensured that it remained out of the public eye, and covered up any evidence that might have exposed the truth. These people had known exactly what was happening, and they had allowed it to continue. The deeper the journalist dug, the more connections he found. Some of the most powerful individuals in the country had been involved, either directly or indirectly, in Mallory's experiments. They had provided the funding, the political backing, and the cover necessary to keep the whole operation running smoothly. And yet, they had managed to stay in the shadows, their names never tied to the hospital or to the brutal experiments that had taken place there. The journalist found himself confronting a chilling reality. The very people who should have been held accountable, those responsible for protecting the public, for ensuring the ethical conduct of medical research, were the ones who had enabled the abuses to take place. As he continued to sift through the evidence, the journalist's dread grew. He realized that this was more than just a story about the hospital, this was a story about the future of society itself. What the government had planned was a chilling vision of a world where control was no longer exerted through laws or policies, but through the manipulation of the very minds of the people. Mallory's experiments had been the prototype, and what had followed, Project Echo, the military applications, the political manipulation, were just the beginning. The goal wasn't just to control the minds of a few patients. It was to control entire populations, to use the techniques Mallory had developed to influence the way people thought, the way they voted, the way they behaved. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that his own work was being watched. The threats he had received, the strange car that had been parked outside his apartment for days, the strange man who had approached him in the coffee shop and asked if he was still digging. They were no longer just idle threats. Someone or something was keeping tabs on him. Every step he took, every conversation he had, every document he reviewed, it was all being monitored. The shadowy figures who had been quietly following him weren't just interested in intimidating him. They were trying to prevent him from getting too close to the truth. And now he knew they would do anything to stop him from exposing it. But despite the growing danger, the journalist couldn't stop. The weight of the story was too great. If he stopped now, if he let the fear of retribution silence him, then everything he had uncovered, all the pain, all the suffering, all the broken lives, would be for nothing. He had a responsibility to those who had suffered in silence for so long, to the victims who had been discarded and forgotten. The world needed to know what had happened, needed to see the truth that had been hidden for so many years. As the deadline for his story approached, the journalist began to feel a deep sense of urgency. He had spent months piecing together the narrative, following the trail of documents, interviews, and testimonies that had led him to this moment. But now he was racing against time. He knew that those who had been responsible for the experiments would stop at nothing to bury the truth. They would use their influence, their power, and their wealth to silence him if they had to. And yet, he also knew that if he didn't publish now, the opportunity would slip away. The files, the documents, the evidence, it was all right in front of him. If he didn't act, if he didn't get the story out, it would be lost forever. It was at that moment that the journalist made his decision. He would go public no matter the cost. He would release everything he had uncovered. The names, the dates, the connections. He would publish the truth, even if it meant exposing himself to the full force of the conspiracy that had been protecting it for decades. He would make sure the world knew about Mallory's twisted experiments, the government's role in them, and the horrifying future they had planned. But even as he prepared to hit send on the final draft of his exposé, the journalist couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had spent so long immersed in the details of the case that he had begun to lose sight of the bigger picture. The evidence was overwhelming, but was it enough? Was it possible that, despite everything, the story might not be enough to bring down the powerful people who had orchestrated this nightmare? What if the truth was just another weapon in their arsenal, something they could twist and manipulate to their own advantage? He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, deep in thought. The darkness of the conspiracy loomed before him, its tendrils reaching into every corner of society. He had found the truth, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the fight was far from over. What he was about to publish would expose the horrors of the hospital's experiments, but it could also set off a chain reaction that would lead to far more dangerous and far-reaching consequences. Would the world be ready for what he was about to reveal? Would anyone believe him? And if they did, what would become of those who had been involved in the cover-up? For the first time in months, the journalist paused, wondering whether his pursuit of the truth had led him to the edge of something even darker than he had imagined. Was he ready to face the consequences of exposing the most dangerous conspiracy the world had ever known? As the cursor blinked on the screen, the decision loomed before him. It was time to reveal everything. The truth was out there. And now the world would finally know. As the journalist prepared to publish his exposé, an unsettling feeling gnawed at him, a mixture of dread and anticipation. He had spent months gathering evidence, analyzing documents, interviewing former staff, and tracking down those who had dared to speak out against the horrors that had taken place within the hospital's walls. But even as the final draft of his article came into shape, something in the pit of his stomach told him that this was not the end. No, this was merely the beginning of a much more dangerous chapter. The truth, once revealed, would set off a series of events that he could neither control nor fully comprehend. But he had come too far to back down now. He could feel the weight of the story pressing down on him like an unrelenting storm, the lives of the victims, the ones who had been silenced, now inextricably linked to his own fate. They had suffered unimaginable torment, all in the name of so-called medical progress. They had been broken, manipulated, and discarded, all while the rest of the world turned a blind eye. These were the people whose stories would finally be told, the ones who had never had a voice, who had never been given the chance to speak out against the monsters who had used them as lab rats. This was his chance to change that. It had to be done. But as he sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the screen in front of him, the nagging doubts crept back in. Was it enough? Had he connected all the dots? Had he gathered enough evidence to make the world believe what had happened behind those closed doors? He had the documents, the testimonies, the hard facts. But would it be enough to topple the powerful people who had spent decades covering up their crimes? For the first time in months, he felt the weight of the truth in a way he hadn't before. This wasn't just about uncovering a medical scandal. This was about exposing an operation that had been hidden for years, one that threatened to upend the very fabric of society. The government, the medical institutions, the military, all had played their parts in creating a dark system of control, manipulating human minds for political and financial gain. He had learned that Mallory's work at the hospital was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader conspiracy that had already begun to seep into the very fabric of modern society. The manipulation and control of the human mind were no longer just theoretical. They were real, and they were being used on a scale that was impossible to ignore.